Well, hello. If you hear crunching sounds today, that is because I gave the dog's bones. Now, Irish money has a complicated history because even after independence in 1922, they kept using the pound sterling until 1927, and even then defined the Free State pound as one-to-one with the British sovereign. And despite changing its name to the Irish pound in 1938, it remained pegged to sterling until Ireland joined the European exchange rate mechanism in 1979. The two countries even decimalised their currency on the same day in February 1971. Now, it is far from unusual for there to be local issue of notes that are one-to-one with sterling. Scotland, Northern Ireland, and a bunch of other places do it. Last time I checked, there were 14 or so banks or governments doing it, and I could probably keep this show going for a few months just on that. However, those are all still under British authority in one way or another. Ireland was de facto an independent country from 1922 and indisputably de jure since 1949. We'll touch on that. Practically, this did not represent too much of an issue as the two countries remained closely linked despite the occasional spat. In 1922, for example, immediately after independence, Britain received 98% of Irish exports and provided 80% of imports. In addition, Britain had more than 20 times the population, and the economy was even bigger relatively than that, because this was decades before Ireland was a rich country. Ireland had an agricultural economy with extremely low productivity and protectionism. It was not until the 1970s, when there was worldwide economic turmoil, inflation in Britain, and Irish trade had diversified a bit, that breaking the link to sterling became worthwhile. Series A. Anyway, by 1928 they had got around to issuing their own notes in the imaginatively titled Series A, also known as the Lady Lavery series, because she sat for her husband Sir John Lavery to provide the main art for these notes. Okay, who is Kathleen Ní Houlihan? Well, Kathleen Ní Houlihan is a personification of Irish nationalism rather than a personification of Ireland per se. The traditional personification of Ireland is Hibernia, but she got portrayed as Britannia's younger and vulnerable sister, in need of her big sis's help to protect her from sinister apes like Fenians or vampiric Parnellites. So you can see she was not exactly popular in nationalist circles. Kathleen Ní Houlihan, aka Catherine the daughter of Houlihan, aka Kathleen bint Houlihan if you're Arabic, is a poor old woman. Most notably, she is the title character in William Butler Yeats' Kathleen Ní Houlihan, where she laments the loss of her house and 4 fields, and is rejuvenated into a beautiful queen when one of the characters goes off to fight and get killed in the rebellion of 1798. I should point out that that's the sort of blood and soil stuff I expect from actual Nazis, but on the other hand, the Irish were an oppressed people, so I guess it is less hashtag problematic coming from them. On the other hand, that's the sort of romantic nonsense that gets people uselessly killed. On the other hand, I possess barely enough emotional intelligence to know I don't have any, so maybe I'm not the best judge of this. On my final, pentapodal appendage, I can point out that whatever Celtic mythic origins being regenerated by other people's blood might have, most of us these days are just going to go straight to vampire. Was not expecting to see those again till I hit Romania, to be honest, but anyway. Now, Sir John Lavery was an Irish artist from Belfast who spent most of his time in England and Scotland and was a war artist in the Great War. His wife was born Hazel Martin, of 6th generation Irish descent, and was apparently described as the most beautiful woman in the Midwest. Which would usually only mean that you could tell her apart from the tractor she's riding or the pig she's holding, or vice versa. But she was the real deal, and apparently quite flirtatious. She's actually from Chicago, and amongst those rumoured to have dragged themselves through her garden are Michael Collins and Winston Churchill, which is probably entirely made up because of malicious gossip, but she was a painter herself, and she did teach Winston to paint. In any case, her husband was sufficiently infatuated with her to paint her around 400 times, which is about as many times as Monet was pottering around Giverny painting water lilies. Lavery had a much better excuse than Monet, that's all I can say. I know what a water lily looks like, thanks. Actually, that's kind of my beef with still life in general. My father would be all into Dutch paintings of fish in a dark room, whereas I'd be more like, don't patronise me! I know what a fish looks like! Now, this well-connected society couple ended up on the fringes of Irish history when their house in London was used by the Irish delegation, including Michael Collins, but eventually signed the Anglo-Irish Treaty. This ended the Irish War of Independence and promptly began the Irish Civil War over whether it was a good idea or not. So on the one hand, it's not surprising that Sir John was hired to provide the image of the personification of Ireland for the new banknotes, nor that he'd use his wife as the model. On the other hand, it is very weird that this personification of Ireland is a vampire played by an American who was a British socialite. On the back of these series were the sculptures of the rivers of Ireland from the Dublin Customs House. I can't tell why each has the features it had, or even to tell them apart, to be honest. Maybe I'm just racist against Hiberno-Fluvians. Plowman series. These were issued in 1929 to replace the banknotes previously issued by 8 Irish banks. Yeah, I said this was complicated. On the front, a man ploughing, surprisingly. On the back, the Customs House in Dublin, St Patrick's Bridge, Cork, the Currency Commission Building, Foster Place, Dublin, the Rock of Cashel in Crawpatrick, and Killiney Bay, County Dublin. Now, I'm quite sure that 4 of these things are beloved and famous landmarks, and one of them is not. Can you guess which? Can you? No? You can't guess which. Okay, fine. Come on, do hug. I think it's another case of central bankers, or in this case, technically the Currency Commission, thinking anyone cares about their stuff. You have got stuff all in your whiskers. Yeah. Yes, I know, you're very beautiful. What's up? Oh, yeah, we go for walks later. It's okay. It's okay. Good. Now then, Series B, Maeve. I think that's how it's handled. The mythical Queen of Connacht. Now, I'm basically unfamiliar with Celtic mythology, but upon cursory examination, it does seem to be considerably less gruesome than Greek mythology. There seems to be way less bestiality, cannibalism, children being born from things other than the very, very short list of things it's okay to birth people from, and as an added bonus, women have some agency. There is still rape, because carry off the cattle and the women, in that order, but it's less fucked up rape, and there isn't any. The king of the gods wanted this girl. Her father hid her in a chicken coop, so Zeus turned into a chicken so he could do her, and thus was born the hero Ornithules. On the other hand, I suppose that's better than having your supreme deity spend their time making up convoluted rules for the lol, so people think they're going to hell for eating a cheeseburger, or indeed acting petulant and sulky because he thinks you haven't been giving him enough attention lately. She is apparently principally famous as the instigator of what I shall refer to as the cattle raid of Cooley, because my Sassenach tongue is not up to pronouncing that. And I think I've got myself in enough trouble already. This is the Irish equivalent of the Iliad, and instead of being about the most beautiful woman in the world, they are fighting over a really, really nice bull. As such, probably a better example of what ancient warrior culture actually spent their time doing. I might get around to reading it someday, but I hope it's not as boring as the Iliad. But then again, I shouldn't judge this sort of thing as literature. It's meant to be recited live for an audience of pissed-up dubros who probably do actually have a game where they take a drink every time you say wine dark sea. On the back, extract from the oldest surviving Irish manuscript, the Book of the Dun Cow, which is not about a dun cow, but is supposedly made from one. 5. John Scotus Eurigenia? I hope I pronounced that right. Well, if I keep doing it, eventually I will hit on pronouncing it right. So yes, John the Scot, because at the time the Irish were referred to as Scots, which is why he has the that thing there, which means born in Ireland. So he is John the Scot, born in Ireland. I thought I'd heard of him, but it turns out I was just thinking of John Duns Scotus. Like JDS, however, JSE was a theologian and also a philosopher. Specifically, darling, yes, specifically a Neoplatonist. There was a time I sort of understood what Neoplatonism was. That time has long since passed, and I'm not interested in a refresher. He went to work in France for King Charles the Bald, who may actually have been extremely hairy, as part of the Carolingian Renaissance, which compared to the actual Renaissance was pretty much only about learning and literature, and much less about art or prancing around on rooftops and stabbing people. Bertrand Russell, of teapot fame, dubbed him the most astonishing person of the 9th century. But then he's Bertrand Russell. He's allowed to make that judgment, as he probably knows enough people from the 9th century. Doubt most people could name one. On the back, excerpts from the Book of Kells, which is a super old illustrated manuscript of the Gospels. £10. Jonathan Swift, who I had not realised was a clergyman, because that's not a profession that I associate with ironic advocacy of infant cannibalism. Of course, QAnon probably think this wasn't irony. Of course, when you talk about Swift to them, they'll think Taylor. Well, part of me thinks it would be hilarious to try to convince these idiots that Taylor Swift is responsible for a modest proposal. She seems like a nice lady, but already gets way too much grief, so I won't. So yes, great satirist and author of Gulliver's Travels, which is not a children's book, which is probably when I tried to read it as a child, I found it impenetrable. I think trying to say something funny about Jonathan Swift is like feeling you should touch up the Sistine Chapel because you think Michelangelo missed a bit. Let's just move on. 20. W.B. Yeats, who I confuse with Keats, or possibly very early internet slang. Poetry is not my thing, okay? It's not his thing either. So yes, figure in the very late 19th century and pre-World War I Irish literary renaissance, and hoping to have a genuinely Irish theatre in Dublin rather than it just being a touring spot for English companies. In 1918, he wrote Kathleen with a C in Houlihan, and whilst talk about how awesome it is to die for one's country is aged about as well as mayonnaise left uncovered in direct sunlight for a few months, I can accept that it was sterling at the time. Nowadays, however, that's the position taken by basically nobody, except suicide bombers, and we're not even sure how sincere they are about it. Even Bono and Patton, who I would not expect to agree on anything except how awesome each think they are that with. He was, however, becoming increasingly detached from mainstream Irish nationalism because it was becoming too plebeian, and didn't publish his poems on the 1960s Rising until 4 years later. He would win the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1923, be appointed to the Irish Senate, and go on to become increasingly disillusioned with individualism, democracy, and liberalism, and was involved with the Irish sort of fascist blue shirts at one point before dying in 1939 in France. 50. Turlough O'Carolan. I like that version better. Contemporary of Swift at the turn of the 18th century. Blinded by smallpox at the age of 18, he learnt the harp. And not the modern harp either, the traditional Celtic harp that was famously difficult to learn and for that reason died out at the start of the 19th century. For example, in 1792 there was a special concert competition in Belfast to try to record as much of this music as possible before it was lost forever. 6 of the 10 Irish participants were blind, because that was a tradition, but I feel slightly dubious about mentioning it for fear that Tiger Mom anti-vaxxers will decide that's a great way to produce a musical prodigy. So yes, blind harpers were a thing, and he made his living the old-fashioned way, touring the country and making up songs for the wealthy patrons who put him up. Allegedly, he was so popular that weddings and funerals would be delayed so that he could perform. Amongst the 214 works in his oeuvre are Shibeg and Shimor, which translates to Small Fairy Mound, Big Fairy Mound, and is about 2 hills near his birthplace. Squire Wood's Lamentation upon the Refusal of his Halfpence, which is about the failure of a cotton coinage issued by an English industrialist whose widespread loathing and disgust of the Irish, including Swift, who also did works on the subject. And variations on a traditional Scottish song, later given definitive lyrics by Robbie Burns as Cock Up Your Beaver. It's about hats, so presumably he was not a fan of the safety dance. 100. The replacement 100 was not in the end printed, so the one with Lady Lavery on stayed in circulation. She is still on all the others, though, because she was the watermark, and would stay there until the adaptation of the Euro. The prepared design was released in 2017 and was going to feature Grace O'Malley, who was the formidable matriarch of the petty kingdom of Umhel in County Mayo on the west coast of Ireland, and who fought both against and then with the expanding feud of power in Ireland, and a lot of people over too, both by land and sea. So yes, she's famous because she's a real-life pirate queen. Notably, she travelled to England to petition Elizabeth in the 1590s, where the two of them had a very long conversation in Latin because neither of them spoke the other's language. Also, we know almost everything about her from English sources because the Irish don't mention her very much, if at all. This may or may not be ironic. Alright, okay, fine, I'll stop touching you then. Dick.